of his arsenal, chemical or otherwise, and lose any incentive whatsoever to move to the negotiating table. It's very clear that the unintended consequences of this strike could very well be a new cycle of escalation, which then drags us into a larger war than we're all seeking to avoid. Some have even suggested that the humanitarian crisis surrounding the Syrian civil war could actually be made worse, as a result of even targeted U.S. strikes. In the end, then, the President's proposal seems fundamentally flawed, since if it's too narrow, it may not deter Assad's further use of chemical weapons, but if it's too broad, it risks jeopardizing the security of these same stockpiles, potentially putting them into the hands of extremists. And that's why I think we're compelled in this case to apply a more traditional standard to whether to proceed with the use of force. One that asks a simple question: does Assad's use of chemical weapons pose a threat to the national security interest of the United States? And the answer to that question is fairly obvious. Even the President himself says it doesn't. Now, one could argue, as I've suggested, that there is an important national security concern at play, that we have a very strong interest in preserving the credibility of our commander-in-chief, regardless of the party in power, and in giving him the political support that reinforces that credibility. This is an issue I take very seriously. It's the main reason I wanted to take my time in making a final decision. But ultimately, I've concluded that being credible on Syria requires presenting a credible response and having a credible strategy. For all those reasons I've indicated, this proposal just doesn't pass muster. Indeed, if through this limited strike the President's credibility is not restored because Assad uses chemical weapons again, what then? And new targets aimed at toppling the regime, which end up jeopardizing control of these same chemical weapons stashes, allowing them to fall into the hands of al-Qaeda or others intent on using them against the United States or our allies, where would the cycle of escalation end? Now, last night we learned about a Russian diplomatic gambit to forestall U.S. military action through a proposal to secure and eventually destroy the Syrian chemical weapons stockpile. This morning there are initial reports that suggest Syria is supportive of it. Let me remind everyone that even if this is agreed to, it's still a long way off to reaching an agreement at the United Nations, to Syria gaining entry to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and to eventually securing and destroying the stockpile. As we've seen in my own state of Kentucky, where we've been working for 30 years to finally destroy a stockpile of chemical weapons, destroying chemical weapons is extremely challenging and requires a great deal of attention to detail and safety. Nonetheless, this proposal is obviously worth exploring. But more broadly, and this is my larger point, this one punitive strike we're debating could not make up for the President's performance over the last 5 years. The only way for him to achieve the credibility he seeks is by embracing the kind of serious, integrated national security plan that matches strategy to resources, capabilities to commitments, and which shows our allies around the world that the U.S. is fully engaged and ready to act at a moment's notice in all the major areas of concern around the globe, whether it's the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, or in the South China Sea. And just as importantly, that he's willing to invest in that strategy for the long term. In Syria, a limited strike would not resolve the civil war there, nor will it remove Assad from power. There appears to be no broader strategy to train, advise, and assist a vetted opposition group on a meaningful scale, as we did during the Cold War. What's needed in Syria is what's needed almost everywhere else in the world from America right now, a clear strategy and a president determined to carry it out. When it comes to Syria, our partners in the Middle East, countries like Turkey.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the time until 7 p.m. be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders. First of all, want to vitiate the quorum call, ma'am?
Without objection.
Thank you, Senator. I ask unanimous consent the time until 7 p.m. be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President, I also ask unanimous consent to enter into colloquy with my dear friend, Senator Heitkamp from North Dakota, so that we can talk about the serious situation that we have before us.
Without objection.
Madam President, approximately 9 days ago, most of us were on a call and being briefed by the administration on what was evolving and how desperate the situation was and how dire it was. And at the time, it was being proposed as an imminent strike that had to be done for the defense of this nation, and we listened to that. Immediately after that, after that conversation we had with many senators and Secretary Kerry, my dear friend, Senator Heitkamp, called me and she said, you know, I would hope we'd have another option. We were looking for an option. The only thing we had before us was to vote either to support an imminent strike or to not support an imminent strike. And it has been proposed, if we don't show the strength of this great country of ours, that it could weaken our standing in the world and our intentions might not be taken seriously the next time. And also the presidency, which none of us want to do. None of us, no matter what side of the fence you may be on. So we kept looking and talking. Cut our visit shorts back. I canceled all my appointments in West Virginia. Senator Heitkamp did the same in North Dakota. And we came back as quickly as humanly possible. We attended every meeting, every briefing, went to my Armed Services Committee meeting and also the Foreign Relations Committee meeting to hear the testimonies from all of the people from the administration that was making that case. At the end of the day, it still did not rise to the level in my mind, and I think the senators too, that we were at a point to where it was national, it would be of an imminent danger to the United States. So with that, we brought all the people together. And Senator Heitkamp, I want her to chime in here, but we kept pushing and pushing the people who had the knowledge, who had been down that road before, military leaders, past and present, diplomats, if you will, and also think tank. And that we finally came up with something that could be done. And Senator, I would defer to you on this. We kept saying if the problem is chemical weapons, how come we haven't addressed? All we knew there was an imminent strike. We weren't going to be able to take out, nor did we intend to take out the regime or change it. We could not put boots on the ground, nor did we have any desire. Nobody had desire for our military men and women to go back in, so we couldn't secure those weapons. And you might want to say how we came to the position that we came to and why we felt it was so important.
I think the first thing to talk about is the ability, I think, first and foremost, to look at the mission and look at the event that led to the need for a discussion in this body and a discussion in this country about our relationship in Syria. And that was the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime in their own home country against their own people. And we know that that activity is not only a crime against the Syrian people, but it's a crime against humanity. It's a crime against an international standard that's been in place since World War I, has been greatly honored because of the devastating effects of using chemical weaponry. And so when we looked at this, and Senator Manchin and I had long discussions with experts in the region, our first concern was securing those chemical weapons and what we could do to make sure those weapons would never again be used on any citizen of Syria and we would not encourage or in any way give permission to another country to engage in that activity. That is fundamentally the greatest interest that we have in securing some kind of resolution here in the United States Congress, is to address that concern. Unfortunately, what we saw was not a targeted resolution that addressed that specific problem. Plus, what we were presented with when we returned were really two options: do nothing, which both of us concluded that you cannot let an attack like this go unresponded to, do nothing or agree to imminent strikes. And that was not a option that either of us saw as appropriate, nor was that an option we could agree to. And so we looked for that common ground, bringing not only the experts listening not only to the experts in the administration, the diplomats, the military experts, the national security folks, but also bringing a broader group of people together to say, what is our mission, how do we accomplish this? And the result really is the resolution that you have before you, Senator Manchin, and the resolution that you and I have advanced for discussion in this body. It seems critical to me that, a week ago, interjecting the chemical weapons ban and the Chemical Weapons Convention into this discussion in a very meaningful way, looking at what is in fact international law, was absolutely critical. Today we have a very fluid and much different landscape. Diplomatically, we'd like to think that these kinds of discussions that have occurred all across the country have driven this, along with the President's discussion with Putin, along with the administration's efforts. And so we now today have a situation where we're glad to see some involvement, we're glad to see some movement, but it is absolutely critical that we remind everyone that actions speak louder than words, and we cannot trust, I don't think, agreements between Russia or Syria until we actually see Syria surrendering these weapons. But today we have an option on the table that is what we call the Manchin-Heitkamp alternative resolution, which can in fact engage us in a broader discussion, engage the international community. And I would say, Senator Manchin, that truly was the motivation behind our work, and I think you'd agree with that.
I sure do, Senator. And, first of all, we all applaud President Obama for bringing it to Congress. We think this is the right place for these types of a decision. And with the consequences that we were facing and the repercussion it could be, but we've come to the conclusion that any type of an imminent strike and the reaction from that would be greater than inaction right now. But doing nothing was not acceptable, and that's how we did come to this, which is basically we call it the Chemical Weapons Control Act. And the thing about the Chemical Weapons Convention that we felt, and we've heard from diplomats, this was the proper course. It was basically giving the Assad regime 45 days. Ours is very straightforward, 45 days to sign and comply. And that means you identify, you secure, and you start eliminating and destroying. And you cannot use and you cannot continue to produce these types of weapons. Also in that 45-day period, we've asked the administration and the President to lay forth a plan for Congress to evaluate on what Syria would look like. What Syria will look like at the end. If they don't sign, what are we to do and how will Syria look? And if they do sign, that still hasn't brought any peace and an end to a civil war. That needs to be looked at also. We've all heard from our constituents, and I think that talking to our colleagues have even heard a lot more. We've had some that says, listen, we don't want strikes under any circumstances. No way on God's green earth that we believe a strike will produce anything but repercussions. And I've said this, and I think Senator and I have talked about this. If you believe that money or military might would change the course and direction of that part of the world which we define as the Middle East or North Africa, if you believe that that will happen, then we would have had success by now. We've spent 12 years at the longest war in our history. We've spent over $1.6 trillion, and the results have not been beneficial whatsoever and lost thousands of lives. I've also said being a superpower means more than just showing the rest of the world that you have the super might to use whenever you feel is necessary. Superpower comes with not only having the super military power, it comes with having the super negotiation ability, the super diplomacy, the super patience, and the super humanitarian aid as needed. And we have the ability to do all of that. That's really what we've asked for. And now we're seeing today evolving not only 24 hours, but with every 24 minutes it seems like something is changing. The Russians have said that they would ask Assad's regime, Syria, to sign or to be involved. Syria says they've accepted. And then we have now that they said they will comply and join the CWC. These are things that we have to continue to try to bring to fruition. And, Senator, on that, we're very happy. I know you and I spoke about that. Our colleagues are looking at different options, that we didn't have an option as of Monday morning. There was no options. It was, are you going to vote to strike or are you not going to vote to strike? And I'm just pleased that we're moving, and I think cooler heads will prevail. I believe the President is open to making sure that the players are sincere and real and mean what they're saying. And I believe now that they've announced to the entire international world that we will sign and we will be honest brokers. Let's put them on the spot and see if they will sign up and be part of this and become part of the 21st century, if you will. So I continue and will continue to work with you. I think that the Geneva Protocol 1925, which prohibit the use of chemical and biological weapons in conflict, but it didn't go far enough, and we know that. Syria signed the Geneva Protocol in December of 1969. They signed that one, but then they would not and have not been a signatory towards the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993. And that's what we're speaking of. And that one specifically says it's the modern-day equivalent of the Geneva Protocol. The international community began negotiating the CWC in 1980 to close the loopholes of the Geneva Protocol. The CWC opened for signature in 93, and after the required 65 ratifications were received, entered into force in 1997. Now, we have, I think, 5 countries that have not signed. Most of all countries, 191, have signed. That's what we're asking them to comply, which we think is the best way, because there is implementation. There is an implementation organization which oversees it, and it's not the United States or not Russia or not any other country taking the lead, but basically it's a way to have the entire international community come back into play.
I think to add another point to what you've spoken about, Senator Manchin, which is the results have not been what satisfactory. I think the other point that we need to make is that the results of all that interaction over this decade plus of activity in this region has not been what was promised, and it has made the American people perhaps cynical and very hesitant to rely on what is being told and said today. And one of the great honors, but also amazing pieces of sadness in my first days of being a senator-elect, I attended 2 funerals for 2 National Guardsmen who were killed in action in Afghanistan. And I remember sitting in the funerals and remembering telling myself, before you vote ever to engage in that kind of conflict, you absolutely need to look at alternatives. You owe it to our men and women in uniform. You owe it to the people of this country who have invested not only the lives of their brothers and sisters and family and friends, but the people who have also invested American treasure. And so what we're seeking is a discussion, a broader discussion beyond 2 opposite and unacceptable alternatives. And what we're seeing this week, much to, I think, our appreciation, is in fact not just our proposal, but other proposals coming forth, a broader discussion about what all the options are, and taking a look at how we can work together as the United States government, speak with one voice and walk together to resolve this conflict. I think we cannot ignore that we have a national security interest in working together. We have a national security interest in addressing and resolving the current issues in front of us, and that discussion can't be done among a small group of senators. It can't be done in back doors with a promise, trust us, because some of that trust has been broken over time. And so a broad, open discussion, as we're having here today, Senator, I think is absolutely critical to reestablishing American trust that we can, in fact, make the right decision in their interest and in the interest, really, of protecting our servicemen from chemical weapon attacks. I mean, that is obviously a great concern of ours. We need to continue to have this dialogue, and we need some kind of response. The question is how measured and what that response should be. And I have very much appreciated your willingness to work with me. And I think the rest of the members who have approached us, who want to talk about this proposal and other proposals, their willingness to broaden their thinking about what those options are.
Well, I'm so proud also to be working with you on this, Senator. Our staffs have worked well together. They're most competent, and they've done yeoman's job. You know, the resolution we've come with basically is the only one out there, an option today, that basically controls the chemical weapons. It actually controls these chemical weapons from ever being used on another human being, which we all deplore. And with that, maybe we can help now move on to trying to help resolve this civil war. The carnage is just unbelievable. You know, they've said there's 99,000 people who have been killed in Syria with conventional weapons and 1,000 with chemical. To me, every one of them is just a life that we can save, we ought to try to save. But with that being said, we've got to give them a chance to become involved, and that's what we've done. And this time last week, we'd have never thought we'd have been here. This time 2 days ago, we did not thought we'd have been here. But we're moving in the right direction. Let me just make it very clear what the resolution that you and I have worked and our staffs have worked on does. It's resolved by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled. The section, our title is this. This joint resolution may be cited as the Chemical Weapons Control and Accountability Resolution. It's basically exactly what it says. The statement of policy is this, the policy of the United States, that the government of Syria must become a signatory to the Chemical Weapon Convention and take concrete steps to comply with the terms and conditions of the convention. Number two, the failure by the government of Bashar al-Assad to sign and comply with the convention clearly demonstrates a willful disregard of international norms on the use of chemical weapons. And number three, if the government of Syria does not sign and comply with the convention within 45 days after the date of the enactment of this resolution, all elements of national power will be considered by the United States government. That reaffirms the war powers that the President has. And I know there's some that doesn't believe that that is constitutional or doesn't believe it's law, but we have checked it and researched it, and it is. And we reconfirm that. It doesn't say that imminent strikes will happen at the end of 45 days. It will be up to the President to determine whether negotiations are moving in the right direction, if all players are being sincere and coming on board. But it gives him the chance to be the President that he's elected to do. Whoever that he or she may be, you want the President's office to be able to exercise the powers that they have by law. And that's what we've done here. Everybody has a different approach. Some places say 45 days, don't need, fine, we're open to all that. We've said that before. But the experts that helped us put this together put the timetables that were reasonable, and they thought they were obtainable.
Senator Manchin, there's some who would question whether this is a capitulation or whether, in fact, this is a lack of showing of American unity. How would you respond to those concerns?
We've had our colleagues. We've had some good conversations with our colleagues. We've had some other people say, "Is this for real? Are you just trying to stall?" I said, no. I don't believe anyone really questions the might of the United States government. I don't think it weakens the United States government to show super restraint, knowing the volatility of that part of the world. Also, past experience in my little state of West Virginia, and I know your great state of North Dakota, feels that you know, when you've tried something and put as much effort as we've put trying to change that part of the world and haven't had the success nowhere near and spent $1.6 trillion at the sacrifice of Americans, then maybe that's not something we should repeat. And we all know that. We've got no support, basically, from our constituents, but those of us who are privileged to all these high-powered meetings, if you will, we haven't been convinced that that will change. So with that being said, I would say to my friends, if you believe that anyone would discount the might of this nation, I don't think so. The resolve of us to protect our country and our Americans, I don't think so. Or to support our allies, our true friends and allies, I don't think so. But you know, back home we have a saying, Secretary, sometimes you don't have a dog in a fight. We can't really find a friend in that fight. That's the problem. That's the hard sell. And with that being said, I've said this before, the Arab League, they should step forward. That's in their backyard. We should give all the support. We have the humanitarian aid. We'll give all the support that we possibly can. But they need to take the lead. It can't always be the Americans being the policemen of the world. And everyone's saying, okay, call 911, which goes right to Washington, and they'll take care of it. And so I discount when they start saying, well, it doesn't show your strength, and we might not have that strength of reputation, or it might weaken the president. No, I don't think so. Not at all.
I think what we would say to the enemies of our country, do not take from this democratic process and this discussion a lack of resolve. We will stand together shoulder to shoulder. This is the process that the Constitution gave us. This is the process that the President has asked us to engage, and it shows the strength of this country, that we can have an open debate, open disagreements, but at the end of the day, we will stand together, and we will stand together strongly against our enemies. And so there should be no comfort taken in any way, shape, or form by the enemies of our country that this somehow weakens our country. In fact, it strengthens our country to have this discussion and then stand shoulder to shoulder together. I do want to mention that during those times last week when we were attending the classified briefings, and a lot of those briefings were bicameral as well as bipartisan. And I know that we have that reputation today of being hyper-partisan, that we can't have meaningful and open discussion. It just degenerates into, you know, pettiness and partisanship. I can tell you from my experience of sitting through every one of those briefings, what I heard was reasoned discussion. What I heard was rational questioning. What I heard was an equal measure of restraint on both the Democrats and the Republican side, and a search for common answers and commonality. And it was that discussion that led us to introducing this type of resolution. And so for those who say this is just another example of dysfunctionality, it's too bad they couldn't look in at those discussions, because I think they would have seen a Congress that was very engaged. They would have seen individual members who weren't looking to score political points, but were looking for information so they could exercise the judgment that their people, their districts or their states elected them to exercise. And so that's the process we're going through, and it's a critical process, but it can't be done yes or no, no other options, and we aren't going to have a broader discussion. And that's why we're grateful for what's happening on the ground. We'll wait to see if it's real. We'll wait to see. It's not enough. Talk is never enough. We have to see action. But in the meantime, we will continue to have these discussions about what is in America's national security interest and how we resolve our collective, how we exercise our collective will with a resolution that reflects our values and our commitment to this country and its national security.
I really believe, Senator, that as the world watches what's unfolding now, they're watching the superpower make a decision. And we are using super restraint. We're using super compassion, if you will, but we're super resolved, and we have the super might to do what we need to do. And I don't think anyone should take that lightly. I don't believe that anyone would take for granted that we will not defend this country and every citizen of this country with everything we have, and try to spread humanity, if you will, all over the world. But it takes more than us as we move outside of the boundaries of the United States of America. We need an international community working with us. We need some of them stepping to the plate not just the rhetoric that we hear, but basic acceptance. We need the United Nations to be functioning again, to have a functional role and have a strong support role, and be able to step to the plate and do it in a fashion that really protects a civilized world. Those are the things we've asked for. And I think this gives it a chance. Today we've seen breakthrough. If President Assad has said, I will sign and I will be a member and I will comply and I will have inspectors come in and I will make sure these weapons are secured and we'll start destroying them, taking them off the shelf. Russia can play a part in that. They can pull their ships up, load them up, take them to a secured area. That's taking that weapon out of that part of the world. And then hopefully they can get people together to start working on this civil war that they have and stop the carnage that's going on with innocent people too. We're hoping all that, but it starts here. People are looking to the United States, and I think they're looking for the leadership that we've been able to give, not just in the military and not just in financial, but in some good, solid, concrete decisions that brings this country and the suffering to an end that's going on in Syria. I'm very proud to work with you on this. We're asking all of our colleagues to be involved in any way, shape, or form. We'll work with them. If there's anyone that has ideas that can better this, make it a more perfect piece of a document, and then we're all for that. I know you've been that way, and I know your team's that way also. So I want to thank you for the work that you've done, and also the friend that you've been, and that I believe that we're close to getting something in the right direction where cooler heads will prevail, and I think the world will be safer.
Thanks, Senator Manchin. I want to thank you for the work that you've done and the leadership that you've shown. I think that when we work together and when we collaborate, when we actually begin that discussion about what's in the American national security interest and how do we fashion a position and a resolution that reflects that national security interest. And when we work together and we open up the opportunity for a broader dialogue, not just two choices, but a broader dialogue so that we can build consensus not only in this body, because if we can build consensus in this body and we can work forward to build consensus in America, we can, in fact, move this issue forward, and it might be an example of what we can do in the future. So thank you again for your participation and your inclusion, and thank you so much for the work that you've done. I think it has been it's offered a very significant alternative, the work that we've done, but it also has, I think, set an example of where we can go in the future.
Thank you, Senator, and I think that the seriousness of Syria is not going to be a military action to correct it. It's going to be diplomacy. It's going to be democracy that hopefully and diplomacy that will work there, and that's what we're trying, and I think we're putting that forward first. More people are coming on board. We appreciate that. We appreciate all of our colleagues on both sides. This is not a partisan issue. It truly hasn't been a partisan issue, and it won't be a partisan issue. This is an American issue that involves all of us, and it's a world issue, which we think that the world has had great interest, but they also have to have participation. So with that, I want to say that I thank you, Senator, and I notice the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Madam President,
Senator from Wisconsin.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, I have come to the floor today to stand up and speak to the important debate we're having about the most sobering issue I face as a senator, as a Wisconsinite, and as an American, the issue of military action by the United States. Let me start by saying that the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons against the Syrian people is morally reprehensible and a serious violation of long-standing international law. The various treaties and conventions addressing these issues have been ratified by most of the world's nations. There is reason why almost the entire world has gathered under the Chemical Weapons Conventions to ban these weapons. It is because chemical weapons are truly barbaric in nature. They are a global threat, and they therefore require a global response. The President has made the right choice to seek congressional authorization for any potential military action in Syria. The gravity of these issues before us are significant, and they deserve a full debate. President Obama should be praised for understanding and appreciating that fact. We must demand that all presidents, not just this president, come to Congress to get approval before taking military action in another country in instances where we are not facing an imminent threat. And I have made that case with both Democratic and Republican presidents. But I strongly believe that our response to this situation must not be a unilateral military action. This is not America's responsibility alone, and it is not in our interest to set the precedent that it is our responsibility alone. Syria violated international laws and should be held accountable by the international community. America must not act alone. The use of chemical weapons is a global atrocity and demands a global response. And that is why I oppose going to war in Syria. And that is why I oppose authorizing military involvement in Syria's civil war. Not for one day, not for 60 days, not for a decade. I believe in engaging and involving ourselves militarily. I do not believe we should involve ourselves militarily in the middle of a brutal, years-long civil war. That would not strengthen America's national security. But the answer is not to do nothing. The answer, rather, is to create a situation where these violations of humanitarian norms and crimes against humanity can be dealt with effectively by the UN and other international institutions. So, we must continue to focus on building a global coalition to support the encouraging developments in the past few days to resolve this crisis without the use of unilateral military engagement in Syria. By working through the United Nations and its institutions, we strengthen international frameworks that can help resolve the conflict in Syria and build a safer and stronger international community moving forward. I firmly believe that the recent potential for progress in today's UN discussions is a testament to American democracy. By President Obama fulfilling his constitutional duties to come to Congress, and by our serious debate here on Capitol Hill, I believe that America has helped drive a more constructive international debate and engagement on Assad's regime's atrocities. We must now give the opportunity of a path forward without military involvement in Syria a chance to succeed. Madam President, I yield back my time. I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
I don't need one thing.
The Senate has spent almost all of the day talking about Syria and a potential resolution on authorizing military force. You just heard from freshman Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin. Earlier in the day, Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania came to the floor to speak.
This week we have a very difficult set of questions to answer as it relates to Syria and the ongoing crisis there. But in particular, we have a question to answer as it relates to what the United States should do. So I rise this morning to express strong support for this authorization to degrade Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons capability and deter the future use of these horrific weapons. Now, I made this determination based upon the evidence and the national security concerns of the national security interests of the United States, both national security interests today as well as in the future. The resolution that's before the United States Senate right now does not allow for the deployment of U.S. combat troops on the ground in Syria. I will not support, nor do I think there'll be much support in this chamber, but I will not support any measure that would involve U.S. boots on the ground in Syria, and this resolution specifically speaks to this concern. And I'm quoting in part the resolution, quote, "The authority granted in Section 2A does not authorize the use of United States armed forces on the ground in Syria for the purpose of combat operations," unquote. So it's important that we make that point. As we've all seen, especially in the last few days, the situation in Syria is in flux, especially in the last 24 hours. The Russian government put forth a proposal yesterday which would have international monitors take control of Syria's chemical weapons in order to avert a U.S. military strike. I am open to this diplomatic discussion, however, not without caution and not without skepticism. Diplomatic solutions are always the preferred path, and military strikes should always be the last resort. I think prior to this proposal, we were at that point of a last resort. But the only reason that this proposal is on the table is because of the credible threat of force that is being debated here in Washington, but even most significantly being debated across the country. The authorization itself should still go forward because it will keep the pressure on the Syrian regime for a diplomatic solution. Now let's spend a couple minutes on our own national security interests. In March of 2011, as reported by the U.S. State Department, multiple news sources, including CNN, reported, and I'll submit for the record a report from CNN on this, that the Syrian government authorities had arrested 15 school children in the city of Dara for spray painting anti-government slogans. These young people were reportedly tortured while in custody, and authorities resorted to force when their parents and others in the community called for their release. Within 1 week, the police had killed 55 demonstrators in connection with the early efforts to provide opposition to the Assad regime. The regime committed countless atrocities during the next 2 years of this conflict, culminating in the unspeakable use, the indiscriminate use of chemical weapons on August the 21st. So, Mr. President, I would submit for the record a report from CNN dated March 1st, 2012, and ask that it be included in the record.
Without objection.
Now, this report is March of 2012, but it looks back in a retrospective fashion on what happened in those early days of the opposition coming together in 2011. And I'll read in pertinent part of what CNN said about what happened when these school children were demonstrating against the regime. They talked in this report about the young people, as I mentioned, not just protesting but spray painting their beliefs against the regime. And at the time, not a lot of people around the world were focused on what was happening in Syria. But let me quote in pertinent part. At one point, one of the commentators, or one of the citizens on the street was saying the people in Dara, quote, didn't want to go against the regime. People thought that this leader, Mr. Assad, was better than his father. Nobody wanted to go face to face with him. But then, of course, it was young people, in this case even school children, who led the way to take him on. So I submit that for the record because this opposition started on the streets of Syria, in this case in Dara, starting with young people. But it, of course, continued from there. And we know that the regime itself has the largest chemical stockpile in the region, one of the largest in the world. We know that Mr. Assad used these weapons against his own people, not only on August 21st, but on multiple occasions prior to that in a much more limited way. We also know that he has the capacity, the will, and unfortunately the track record to use these weapons against innocent civilians. We also should remember that we have troops and other military and diplomatic personnel in the region, in the Middle East. Even Syria's very acquisition of chemical weapons threatens our national security. In 2003, the Congress of the United States, and some people have forgotten about this, the Congress of the United States in 2003 passed the Syria Accountability and Lebanese Sovereignty Restoration Act.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We are back from the August recess, and I'm here now for the 42nd time to try to wake this body up to the threat of climate change. Today I've come to talk about some of what went on during the recess while we were away in my home state of Rhode Island and around the globe. Here is some of what happened in Rhode Island. On August 14th, Nancy Sutley, the chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, joined me in Rhode Island to deliver a clear message. As she said, I quote, "Climate change poses a very real threat to public health, both now and in the future. Warmer temperatures in our Northeast mean harmful ozone can form very quickly. That leads to the bad air days that we hear about on the news when children with asthma and other vulnerable citizens
are urged to stay indoors, often on what appear to be beautiful, sunny summer days. Nancy Sutley and I heard from Nick Friend, a 15-year-old from East Providence, and Kenyatta Richards, an 8-year-old from Warwick, about the 6 Rhode Island bad air days we've had already this year that threaten Nick and Kenyatta's health and thousands more children. In Narragansett, a lovely Rhode Island beach town, I visited 2 sites that sustained significant damage during Hurricane Sandy to see how that town is using recovery aid to repair roads and public housing. People in Narragansett realized that rebuilding is not enough. We need to start adapting for future storms. The oceans are warming undeniably, and as they warm, they expand, so sea levels rise, leading to more erosion and flooding. Tide gauges in Newport show an average sea level increase of nearly 10 inches since 1930. So storm surges, like the damaging surge last year from Hurricane Sandy, will batter our shores further inland, and we have to adapt to that. So in Westerly, Rhode Island, town officials and the University of Rhode Island's Coastal Resources Center held an informational meeting about the effects of sea level rise on the town's coastal wetlands, planning for 1, 3, and 5 feet of coastal sea level rise so that Westerly can create a community-wide adaptation plan. Cranston, Rhode Island had been hit hard by the floods of 2010. In August, during this recess, demolition crews began tearing down homes in a neighborhood near the Patuxent River to buffer the surrounding homes to protect against future flooding. Cranston also announced a series of climate change workshops to increase awareness about the threats facing city residents and to help them plan ahead. So that's some of what happened in Rhode Island. Nationally, in August, the Rim Fire burned in California near Yosemite National Park, the 3rd largest wildfire on record in California. No one can say that climate change caused this fire. Wildfires have been happening forever. But hotter, drier years make for worse wildfire seasons. Spring and summer temperatures are edging up, snow is melting earlier, wildfire season is lengthening, and the intensity of wildfire season is increasing, as state and federal fire and forest managers forewarned our bicameral task force in a hearing just before the recess. During August, nearly all of New Mexico experienced drought, with the majority of that state in severe, extreme, or exceptional drought. In late August, the Bureau of Reclamation announced the first reduction of outflows from Lake Powell since the reservoir was filled in the early 1960s. Tens of millions of people who rely on the Colorado River for water will be affected. Reports are that a late August heat wave in the Midwest caused school closures in Minnesota, and students were released early from schools in Colorado, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Again, it's the loaded dice phenomenon. You can't assign specific blame for this heat wave to climate change, but on a planet with hotter summers, we can expect worse and more frequent heat waves. So that's nationally. Globally, NOAA announced that July 2013 was the 6th warmest July on record. I was traveling in Asia during the recess with Senator John McCain, immediately following record-setting heat. In mid-August, temperatures passed 105 degrees Fahrenheit in Shanghai, China, the hottest temperature measured in the city since records began to be kept about 140 years ago. The temperature in Shimanto, Japan, hit 105 degrees Fahrenheit, the hottest ever recorded in that nation. South Korea's President Park talked with us about climate change and its importance in Northeast Asia. And while we were there in South Korea, the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy had warned of power shortages due to high temperatures. So we met with public officials in rooms with air conditioners shut off to save power. Senator McCain and I heard from China's leading climate official, Minister Xie, about China's plan to invest almost $475 billion on clean energy and emissions-reducing projects through 2015, nearly $500 billion between now and 2015, and about 7 regional cap-and-trade programs that will eventually include other large cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and Tianjin. For my colleagues who say China must act first on climate change, they are acting, and we should not look to them for an excuse to delay action here at home. Indeed, a report recently by the Pew Charitable Trusts described China as, and let me quote this, China, the epicenter of clean energy finance, attracting $65.1 billion in investment. It garnered 25% of all solar energy investment, 37% of all wind energy investment, and 47% of the investment in the, quote, other renewable energy category. That's what the Pew report said about China. The report compared that to the, and I quote again, disappointing U.S. performance in the worldwide race for clean energy jobs, manufacturing, and market share. Madam President, that's not a race we want to lose, and yet we are exhibiting disappointing performance against China. August was also a month for the usual climate denial. One of our Senate colleagues reportedly self-declared that he was a global warming denier and said he believes evidence points to the Earth entering a mini ice age. One California representative told constituents, just so you know, global warming is a total fraud. A conservative representative from Iowa told his constituents, climate change is not science, it's more of a religion than science. A representative from Florida said, our climate will continue to change because of the way God formed the Earth. August even brought a climate denier opinion piece to my home state, Providence Journal. Climate science is in turmoil, the piece said, because global surface temperatures have been flat for 16 years. Rhode Island's PolitiFact quickly determined that this claim, and I quote, cherry-picked numbers and leaves out important details that would give a very different impression. In truth, there have been steps in the upward march of global surface temperature before. But my skeptical colleagues should read about these steps and what may cause them in mainstream news outlets, which explain that while these pauses do happen, they have not and do not heralded the end of climate change. And, setting aside surface temperature for a moment, we continue to see warming, rising, and acidifying oceans. The recess brought the latest issue, for instance, of National Geographic, whose cover story is Rising Seas. Let me read 2 excerpts. A profoundly altered planet is what our fossil fuel-driven civilization is creating. A planet where sandy-scale flooding will become more common and more destructive for the world's coastal cities. By releasing carbon dioxide and other heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere, we have warmed the Earth by more than a full degree Fahrenheit over the past century and raised sea level by about 8 inches. Even if we stop burning